Terence Parker, Terry, to his friends, looked up. It was getting dark. The late October sky was turning a dusky gray blue. He could feel the cold creeping in through the ancient double-hung sash window. He rose, feeling the soreness in his legs and shoulders. He'd spent all Monday clearing out the attic, lowering everything through the cramped trapdoor and carting it down 3 flights to the street. My back is going to kill me tomorrow for sure, he thought with a bitter smile. Just about everything else he had found that day barely deserved to be called junk. The large iron-bound trunk was the exception. It had been completely hidden from view, entombed beneath decades' worth of moth-eaten periodicals. After clearing a space, he'd dragged it to the center of the room to get a better look. There was a faded square of parchment fixed to one broad oaken side. He turned it towards the window and held his head at an angle. He squinted, trying to read the faint lettering in the fading light. "It's no use," he sighed. "The sunlight's gone, and my flash and my tools are back at the storage locker." He wished he could turn on a lamp, but the power had been cut off weeks before. "Don't know how I'd get the darn thing downstairs without some help, anyway," he reminded himself, talking out loud to the walls. "I'll just crack it open up here and see what's in it." He sighed deeply. "It's probably just full of more junk. Anyways, I got no tools, and tomorrow's another day. At least I managed to clear out most of the space." The discovery of the trunk was unexpected and exciting. What if it contained something valuable? He thought, daring himself to hope. He shook his head. "I've got to make sure that those greedy bastards from the bank don't get wind of it. If they got a whiff of money, they'll be hounding the kids and making their lives miserable." Come what may, his plans were made. He just wanted to be sure that they would be left in peace. It was funny how he'd found it. All these years he'd been living in the house with Sherry, and he had never gone up the trap door into the attic. Only now, as he struggled to comply with the terms of the eviction order, had he realized just how much flotsam had collected up there. "Damned vultures," he thought. He hunched his 6'2" frame to miss the low-hanging beams over the wooden trap as he made his way down the ladder, feeling his way in the darkening gloom. They swooped in, and that was all she wrote. He shook his head in disgust as he reached up and swung the door closed. Come next week the house would be gone. Bank-owned foreclosure, the sign in the front read. It wasn't official yet, but it soon would be. The Great Recession had hit their little part of New England hard. Not that the town had ever been booming. The current downturn was just the latest in an endless series of calamities that had swept through the region over the last 3 decades. Terry had been only 18 months shy of full retirement when he was laid off. His company had been bought out by some giant multinational, and the entire Northeast Division shuttered. Needless to say, his pension was worthless. After that, the only thing that had kept them afloat was the income from Sherry's little shop in town. When she had gotten sick, the Affordable Care deductibles had eaten through their small nest egg in a matter of months. He'd tried to keep the shop going on his own, but it was no use. He'd been forced to close it up the previous January. Sherry had passed away a month later, and by then the mountain of unpayable debt had grown beyond all hope of cure. At least the kids were okay, he thought. Sherry's son, Michael, was living out west. He had a nice career working for some startup in Silicon Valley. His daughter, Therese, and her husband and their 2 kids had been up to visit just last week, helping with some of the moving. "Maybe you should come down south and stay with us for a while, Dad," she'd suggested as they were getting ready to leave. "You know, the grandkids would love it." He'd thanked her and promised that he would think about it, but he and she both knew that it would not happen. "She's just worried about you," he heard in the back of his mind. He always loved how Sherry's voice would come to him when he was feeling low. He'd gotten into the habit of talking back, and they would share a conversation. "I know, Cher," he said softly, "but you know I got my mind set. They don't need me messing up their lives, and I don't want to be a burden." He was not leaving New England. All of his life, his life with Sherry was tied to this place. He took off his bifocals, rubbing sudden tears away from the corners of his faded blue eyes. Therese was wrong anyways, he thought. He knew exactly where he was going to stay. Ah, hell, Sherry, I miss you more each day. He thought back to when they'd gotten together. It was amazing how much they had had in common, and how quickly they had hit it off. They were both single parents. His wife had been hit by a drunk driver 3 blocks from their old apartment. Sherry's husband had been killed in some hellhole in Nam. Therese had been almost 2 when her mom passed away. Sherry had been pregnant when she got the news, and she'd named Michael after his late papa. Grieving, Sherry and her baby boy had returned to live with her father in her childhood home. When her dad passed, she had inherited everything. Their home was old and chock full of bric-a-brac. Her people had always been seafarers and merchantmen, collecting peculiar objects from all over the world. The house itself, dating back to the late 18th century, had been built by her great-great-grandfather. Sherry'd always claimed that her family roots went right back to the Mayflower. To make ends meet, Sherry had opened up a little curio shop in town, had stocked it with antiques, collectibles, and carved wooden toys, drawing from the cluttered contents of her oversized home. Michael had been only 4 at the time. She used to keep him in the back room, letting him nap while she worked the register and dealt with the few customers. That's where they had first met. He'd come into her shop looking for a birthday gift for his daughter. He and Sherry had fallen into a conversation, talking for hours about the challenges of raising young children. She was so easy to talk to. One thing had led to another, and he'd ended up asking her out for a date. He'd moved in after they'd been going together for a few months. A year later they had married. That was almost 40 years ago now. They had had their ups and downs, but they had always found a way. But Sherry was gone, and the house was gone. This was the end. The rest of the house was already stripped bare, rooms empty of all but memories. If Michael had not reminded him when he called on Sunday night to check the top-floor attic, likely the stuff stored up there would have been abandoned. Too bad, he'd thought. Now that I know about it, I just can't leave it. Terry had considered letting the bank deal with the junk, but they would likely find a way to tack a few extra $1,000 onto the settlement charges for not clearing out the place. No sense in leaving a mess for the kids, he had concluded. The sheriff's sale was scheduled for a week from Wednesday. He'd originally planned to be done with everything by Sunday night. Tomorrow it'll all be complete, he muttered as he started his beat-up Chevy. And then, he breathed, I can rest. The next afternoon, Terry returned to the house. Despite his sore legs and back, it had only taken a couple of hours to clear out the last of the junk. Soon the only thing left was the trunk. It's too darned heavy to move, he muttered. He'd crack it open right there. If there was anything valuable in it, he'd make one more trip to the car to stow it. He'd leave the trunk itself right where it was. It's nice and sturdy, he thought. It'll do nicely. Outside, the light was fading when Terry got to the top of the ladder for the last time. He had pulled the trunk farther away from the wall to get at more junk stacked up behind it. It stood alone now near the center of the space, under a high-peaked gable. The oaken sides were half in shadow. He had remembered to bring his flash this time, as well as a hand truck, a good length of stout hemp, and some tools. He bent to re-examine the old label, training his light on the faded lettering. It was handwritten in spidery script, a poem, or a fragment of one. And all that memory loves the most was once our only hope to be, and all that hope adored and lost hath melted into memory. How strange, he thought. The verse is Byron, I think, but it's been so long I can't be sure. He stared at the inscription. Something else about it bothered him. It almost reminds me of Sherry's handwriting. He continued shaking his head. But that can't be. He stepped back, considering how he might open it. The black iron banding and lip would certainly resist any efforts to break into the interior. His curiosity about what was in the trunk had grown all day. "Well, it's high time to find out what's in you," he declared as he rummaged in his tool kit for a long crowbar. "Let's see if I can get the lock to pop." The lid was secured by a hasp, and an old cast-iron padlock shaped like an upside-down pyramid, with a bas-relief of an all-seeing eye on its face. In the center of the eye a keyhole had been cunningly fashioned where the pupil should have been. The hasp behind the lock was loose. He placed his flash on the floor, angling the light to provide the best illumination. He set the curved tang of the crowbar under the shank of the lock and took a deep breath. "Here goes," he thought, and pulled with all his might. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. For a moment he was disoriented and shook his head to clear it. Mid-afternoon sun was shining into his eyes, blinding him. Automatically, he reached up and lowered the cloth shade to block it. "How the heck did I get here?" he wondered. He was driving on the old post road, heading out of town. For the life of him, he could not remember starting the car. His head was pounding. He took one hand off the wheel and rubbed his eyes. From his right he heard a sweet, familiar voice. "Are you okay, honey? You look a little pale." Startled, Terry took his eyes off the road. He stared at the petite figure seated on the other side of the broad bench seat. Her bright red lips were puckered in concern, and her eyes were dark and a little sad. The black lace veil she wore was stark against her pale cheeks. Terry's hands shuddered violently and he clenched the wheel. The car lurched and swerved towards the shoulder as they entered a curve. "Terence!" she screamed. "Watch the road!" He tore his gaze from her face and jerked the car back into the lane, tires squealing in protest. She cried out in fear, "Please, dear, pay attention!" She reached across and gripped his elbow as he regained control of the sedan and completed the turn. He stared rigidly out the windscreen as the road became a scenic straightaway. His mind was racing. What's happening? How can she be here? He drew a ragged breath, fighting to keep his hands from shaking. Her grip on his elbow relaxed. She began stroking his arm, trying to calm him as she always did. "Terry," she said softly, "I know you're upset. We're all grieving. Your father was a wonderful man." Her voice grew hoarse, and she broke off, unable to continue. He took another deep breath, centered the wheel, making sure his father's '53 Bel Air would stay well within the confines of the road, and glanced at her face. Almost in a whisper he said, "Mom?" "Yes, darling?" "I love you," he said, his voice shaking. She looked at him and sighed, a tear forming in the corner of one eye. "Oh, Terence, you're such a wonderful boy. Don't worry, everything will be all right." Her touch sent chills up his arm. He wanted to stop the car, pull over, hug her, and never let her go. "I've missed you so much," he was thinking. "I never cried more than I did the day I lost you." He was overwhelmed with emotion, his heart pounding out of his chest. Wonder, sadness, joy, and disbelief were at war within him. He stole another glance at her. She was dead, he thought. He had suffered through every moment of her terrible illness, watched helplessly as her body was ravaged by disease. She had been little more than skin and bone when she passed, unrecognizable. Is this some sort of dream? He wondered. He remembered the day his father had been laid to rest, and how he and his mother had driven home alone together after the burial. That day was now, this moment. Up ahead on the left, Terry could see Steiger's diner, and suddenly he knew that his mother was about to speak, and his lips parted. "Terry, dear," she said, "I don't feel like going home just yet." He knew exactly what she was going to say. "Let's get something to eat at Steiger's. My treat." He closed his mouth and nodded, slowing the car and turning into the lot. He knew they would have a late lunch together in the diner. His mother would tell him stories about his dad, and they would reminisce for hours. It was one of his happiest memories. He pulled the sedan into a spot near the door. The parking lot was mostly empty. It was well after noon, and the regular midday crowd was long gone. He set the parking brake and pulled the key out of the Bel Air, almost unable to breathe. How can I talk to her? He thought in a panic. How can I tell her that she died, or that I know how she's going to? He opened the door and climbed out. Suddenly his mouth went dry and his head swam. He placed a hand on the door frame to steady himself. A band of tension crushed his chest, and he felt as though he might be sick. The passenger side door swung shut. "Terry!" his mother cried, her voice full of concern. She ran quickly around the front of the sedan and grasped at his hand. "Mom!" he tried to say, but his throat constricted, cutting off his breath. A black ring bounded his sight, and a high-pitched whine sounded in his ears. Suddenly he was falling. The pavement rushed towards him as he crumpled to the ground. Blinding light from his flash shone into his eyes, and he squinted against the glare. He sat up slowly. What in the world? He raised one hand, wiping tears from his cheek. Blinking to clear his vision, he peered into the gloom. He was in the attic. The back of his head was sore, and he could feel a good-sized goose egg on it. The crowbar was lying next to him. The last thing he remembered was falling backward as the lock suddenly popped. "I must have hit my head," he muttered, unwilling to explore his vision further. No telling how long he'd been out. The attic window was a void. Its rippled glass reflected a distorted caricature of his face. I'd forgotten how much I missed her, he thought sadly, his heart pounding. He swallowed hard. When she died, I thought my whole world had ended. A cold chill ran down his spine, and the hairs on the back of his neck tingled. His mother was long dead. He was 72 years old, and she had died almost 3 decades ago. It didn't matter. I still miss her, he thought, his face burning. He looked down, thinking of Therese and Michael and the grandkids. Am I any better? His hands trembled. It must have been a dream, but it seemed so real. He shook his head sadly, got up off the floor, and leaned down to retrieve his flash, which he turned on the trunk. The lock was open. He took a deep breath. "Well," he said with mock sarcasm, "after all that trouble the least you can do is take a look." The house was deathly silent. He willed himself to move, but his right arm remained rigidly at his side, and his fingers felt numb. He was afraid. Dark shadows pressed in on him, and the glass cast odd reflections in the corners of his sight. "Come on, you coward," he exhorted himself. "You've come this far. Open it." He took a shuffling step closer, unhooked the lock shank, and lifted it. It squeaked, the pitch so high it set his teeth on edge. He set the lock down and lifted the hasp. The lid of the trunk rose, springing up slightly under his hand. A narrow, inky black gap revealed itself between the lid and base. An odd sort of smell, dusty, sickly sweet, wafted into the air. "Smells like death," he thought. His throat went dry, and he jerked his hand back from the hasp. He stared at the gap, petrified, his heart pounding. What if there's something in there? A body. A fit of trembling passed through him, and he nearly dropped the flashlight. He stood frozen by the side of the chest. He shuddered, then stamped his foot in anger. "You crazy old man," he snarled in the dusty silence. "This is Sherry's house. This trunk's probably been up here for 200 years. You believe in monsters all of a sudden?" He rested one hand on the chest, letting his fear slowly ebb. "It's just kind of spooky, that's all," he muttered sheepishly. He took a few more deep breaths as his heart began to slow. "Okay, Mr. Treasure Hunter, this is it," he said aloud. "Open it up. If there's anything worth a dime inside, you still have to get it down to the Chevy, and time's a-wastin'." With the flash in one hand, he reached for the lid. His heart thumped in his chest as he strained to lift it, but it refused to budge. He set the flash down on the floor again, angling the light up. He stooped, bending his sore knees, reached under the lip of the trunk with both hands, and lifted with all his might. "It's moving," he thought. The trunk hinges gave way with a hideous groan, and the lid flew up. He sat down heavily in the opposite direction and threw his arms out to break his fall, sending the flash spinning. He sat still for a moment. His breath rasped in the silence. The exertion and the sudden fall had knocked the wind out of him. The trunk sat open, cloaked in shadow. He rose, groaning with the effort. Man, will I ever be glad when this is over? He peered into the black well that yawned in the base of the trunk. His eyes were drawn to a subtle sparkle in the darkness. "Whoa! There's something in there!" he exclaimed. Terry scrabbled under the low eaves, grabbing for his errant flash. "God, Sherry," he thought, "if only we'd known. We could have paid for better doctors. We didn't have to lose the house." He stepped back over the trunk and shone his beam into it. Disappointment hit him like a ton of bricks. Empty. He searched every corner. The dark oak panels were held in place by iron cleats. There was no sign of the sparkle he'd seen in the gloom. He stared at the space in disbelief. "Figures," he muttered sourly. "I must be getting old Cher. I'm seeing things that just ain't there." His shoulders slumped, and he sighed deeply. Well, that just about seals it. He was surprised at how low he felt. "I guess I just was hoping to find something to leave for the kids." He shook his head. "At least I don't have to carry anything down to the car." He rubbed his eyes. He was tired. All the excitement was leaching out of his system, and his head was aching. "Okay, Sherry," he said in a soft whisper. "I guess I'll get set up. I'm ready, and there's nothing else left to do now." He turned, located his tool bag, and set his flash once more on the floor. He made sure the beam he had picked out was well lit. He sat down with his back to the trunk and grabbed one end of the rope. He'd learned a lot about knots from watching videos online. "Damned box is good for something," he muttered, concentrating on his craft. The rope was a bit old and stiff, but seemed strong. Once he'd finished, he'd figure out how to secure it. He reached over the trunk and closed the lid. The hinges protested, less loudly than before, and the heavy lid swung shut with a bang. He got up behind it and pushed it into place. This should work as well as anything, he thought. The lid was a bit tricky. The curved wooden slats and iron bands resembled the side of a giant barrel. He got up on top of it, balancing awkwardly. "Careful," he warned himself with a wry smile. "Don't want to fall and break a leg." The peak of the roof was a couple of feet higher than he could reach, even standing on the highest curve of the trunk lid. Darn it, got to loop the end over the main strut, or it'll never hold the weight. He cast about, looking for inspiration. Aha! The crowbar! He clambered down and retrieved it from the floor. It looked to be long enough to reach up and get the rope over the beam. He reascended and managed to work the bar through the gap. The hooked end grabbed the rope and carried it to the floor, landing with a loud clang. He got down. "That's the ticket, Cher," he muttered. He pulled the free end of the rope, making sure the knotted end moved up and down. "Good job, Terry, old boy. Give yourself a hand." A moment later he'd tied off the rope and he was standing beside the trunk. His heart was pounding. He stepped carefully up, balancing once more on the curved top. He looked down and nodded. Should be enough of a drop, he told himself. He ran the hemp loop over his head and slipped it snug against his neck. He took a deep breath. The noose height is a bit of a guess, he thought. If everything worked out, it should pull me up short, a good foot or so above the floorboards. He shook his head. "I hope I made the knot properly," he muttered. Don't want to hang there and choke to death. He knew a good knot would tighten and twist simultaneously, snapping the neck clean. He took a deep breath and composed himself, tapping into the well of agony he carried within his heart. "Sherry," he prayed, "I lost everything when I lost you, and I can't live here any more without you." He stood straight on his tiptoes, closing his eyes. "I know what you would say. Think of the kids, Tara. They need you. But you're wrong. They don't need me. I'm just a burden to them, Cher. The only one who needed me was you." He paused, listening for her reply, but heard nothing. He took one last breath, shuddering as he exhaled. "See you soon, kid." He leapt into space. "Terry!" a bright female voice called, echoing up from the lower floor. "Terry!" it continued, getting louder. He turned over, snuggling a bit deeper into the soft comforter. Bright sunshine angled through the new curtains Sherry had hung in their bedroom the week before. A savory smell of sausage wafted in from the hallway. "Come on, Cher," he thought with a smile. "Give me a break. It's Sunday. No use." The bed began to shake. A tremor ran through the creaky floorboards, moving in his direction. High-pitched voices echoed up the stairs from the lower landing. "It's my turn." "No, my turn." Terry burrowed even further under the blankets, with a couple of pillows over his head. He held his breath. The tremble became a rumbling charge. Breathless squeaks filled the air as the door of their bedroom burst open. "Daddy?" Therese called from the foot of the bed. "Daddy! Where are you?" Michael didn't waste any words. He clambered up on the sideboard and threw his sturdy 6-year-old frame on top of the pillows. "I found you!" he cried with joy, jumping on Terry's shoulders. "I found Daddy!" "No fair," Therese pouted, but only for an instant. She joined her brother on the bed and began burrowing under the covers. "Tickle, tickle, Daddy," she cried, trying to rouse him. "Mommy says it's time to get up." He groaned from beneath the covers. "I'm not Daddy. I'm the blanket monster." They screamed in pretend fright and jumped all the more excitedly. The romp became a tickle war, and soon the three of them were tossing pillows across the counterpane and laughing uproariously. Terry got up and swooped up Michael in his arms. He bent down to allow Therese to cling to his shoulders. "Ah!" he cried. "The blanket monster is hungry." Suddenly he looked up, his voice cut off in mid-cry. Sherry stood in the doorway. Her dark brown eyes contained a warm smile. The three of them looked at her. "Mommy!" Michael cried as he jumped down and ran into her arms. "Hi, you little monster," she said, kneeling down to his height and wrapping her arms around him. She looked up at Therese. "I see you guys managed to find the big monster." Therese nodded her 8-year-old curls sagely. "The blanket monster tried to eat us, Mommy," she cried. "But we escaped and fought back with pillows." Sherry smiled and stepped in close. "Hey, monster," she said softly, curling an arm around his waist. "Want to come down and ravage some breakfast?" "Absolutely," he replied, leaning in for a kiss. She said, shaking her head. "Not till you get rid of that monster stubble." It didn't seem to bother you last night, Mrs. Monster," he replied with a smile. "Just you march in there and clean up, and hurry up. Breakfast is getting cold." She pecked him on the cheek and bundled the kids off downstairs to eat. "I love her so," he thought as he watched them go. "I'm so blessed to have found her." He made his way down the hall into the bathroom, turning the hot tap on full. The ancient plumbing responded with its normal knocks and groans. He stuck his hands in the cold stream. He knew it would be a few minutes before it turned hot, but the icy splash was refreshing. He grabbed a towel and dried his face, but when he glanced up at the mirror, shock widened his eyes and he froze. "Something's not right," he thought in a panic. "That's not my face." He stared at the reflection. His hair was glossy and black, and his eyes were bright blue and twinkling on either side of his rather unfortunate nose. Dad always said I had a face for radio, he thought with a wry grin. But almost as soon as he smiled, it morphed into a look of concern. "This face is young," he whispered, drawing his hand across his unshaven cheek. He was old. His face should be wrinkled, and his hair should be thinning and gray. This is like that weird dream, he thought frantically. Last time I saw my mom, and now... He dropped the towel and, leaving the water running, raced down the hall to the stairs. "Sherry!" he cried in terror. "How can I tell her?" he thought in a blind panic. "Sherry, I've missed you so much. I'd forgotten how happy you made me feel, how blessed a life we had, you and me and the kids. How much I loved you all." He took the stairs 2 at a time, heedless of where he put his feet. 4 steps up on the last flight, he hooked a toe on the loose runner. "Sherry!" he cried as he fell headlong, arms spread in a vain attempt to break his fall. The floorboards at the base of the stairs rushed towards him. Terry dug his fingers deep into the loose dirt at the bottom of the foam cup. "Got 'em!" he exclaimed. Deftly he extracted a wriggling night-crawler and held it up to the light. "Don't take all the big ones," Michael whispered in the still morning air. Terry smiled back. "Hey, that's my line," he replied with a grin. "Yeah, was," Mike shot back with a giant grin of his own. "You used to tell me that every time we went fishing. I figured I'd get ahead of you this time, old man." Terry laughed and baited his hook. He felt a warm glow. He and Mike had been coming to the fishing spot since the boy was 10. They would always pack a cooler, rent a boat, and spend the day together on the lake. "Here's hoping you at least get your bait back," he teased, expertly casting his line out onto the still water. Behind him he heard Mike do the same. God, he thought, I love him like he was my own from birth. Sherry and he had tried to have children of their own, but things had never clicked. As the years went by, they'd both come to realize that it didn't matter. Therese and Mike were as close as any 2 children could be. They'd no need for any others. "We made it work, Cher," he thought with pride. "It was a heck of a lot of effort, but look at the results." He stole a glance over his shoulder at Mike, a fine young man now who had been studying computers at the local university and getting ready to graduate the following year. Terry's heart was just bursting. Suddenly he felt a tug on his line. "Hey, Mike, get the net. I think I've got one." He reeled in a few clicks and stopped, staring at the top of his red and white bobber. "That's it," he thought. "Just take one more bite." Mike had placed his pole down and was at his side with the net. "Wait on him, Dad," he breathed. "Hey," Terry whispered back with a smile. "Who taught you how to fish, anyway?" He turned to look at the boy. "Dad, your bobber!" Mike cried. Terry jerked the line too late. "Shucks, missed him." Mike patted him on the back as he reeled in his tackle. "Don't worry, partner," he said, and paused. Together they continued in unison. "You'll get 'em next time." They broke up laughing. "I guess you've got all my lines down now, don't you?" Terry said. Mike stopped laughing, and a somber look appeared on his face. "Dad?" "Yes?" Mike paused, looking down. Terry waited. The kid was building up to something, and he knew he needed to just listen and let him work his way through it. Mike raised his head slowly, looking Terry right in the eyes. "Dad, I never knew my father. I mean, my real father, Mom's first husband." He swallowed hard. "I spent years wondering what he was like, what my life would have been like if—" His voice choked, and he looked down, wiping a tear from his face. Terry sat still, mind racing. Suddenly he knew what Mike was going to say. He remembered the day that Mike and he had gone fishing together, the day that had changed everything. He remembered how he'd agonized for him. "Mike!" he wanted to scream. "It's okay. I understand. I love you, and I've always loved you." He knew in a few moments he would say just those things. He would hold Mike in his arms and rock him as he sobbed his heart out. "I'd forgotten," he thought. "I'd forgotten just how much he meant to me. How much different both our lives would have been if Sherry and I had never met." Terry shook his head. He struggled to draw a breath as pain filled his chest. Mike looked up again. Tears were streaming unchecked from his eyes. "I want you to know that. For years I resented you. I used to wish that he had lived. I blamed you for him not being there for me. I knew it was wrong. All I wanted was the chance to know him and have him in my life." He paused, drawing a shuddering breath. "But you know what?" "No, Mike," Terry whispered. "What?" Mike stared at him and then launched himself into the older man's arms. "I found him," he sobbed as the boat rocked back and forth on the still water. He buried his face in Terry's broad shoulder. "I found him in you." Tears rolled down Terry's cheeks. He hugged Mike as if he were a child again, just letting the emotion wash through them. His head was spinning. A great roaring filled his ears, and black waves blotted out his sight. "Sherry!" he cried into the rushing darkness. "What have I done?" "Mr. Parker?" Somebody touched his shoulder. "Mr. Parker!" He started, and his eyes jerked open. It was the night nurse, the one Sherry did not care for. He sat up, rubbing his aching neck. "Yes?" he replied in a hoarse whisper. She withdrew her hand, a disapproving look on her face. "Your wife is asking for you," she sniffed. "Follow me." He got up as quickly as he could. He'd fallen asleep on the couch in the hall by Sherry's room. His neck felt as if it was broken. He glanced at his watch. It was almost 3 a.m. The nurse swung open the door and held it for him. "Mr. Parker, I've got another patient who needs me now. Please press the call button when you are finished." Terry nodded and pushed past her. The room was dark and stuffy. The only illumination came from one dim light directly overhead. He moved quickly to Sherry's side, careful not to disturb the coils of tubes and blinking monitors clustered by her bedside. She was propped up on the elevated mattress. Her wasted body barely made a bump under the thin hospital sheets. Her eyes were closed. "Cher," he whispered as he drew near. "I'm here." She sighed, and the hand closest to him twitched. He placed his hand over hers. Her fingers were cool to his touch. "I came as soon as the nurse called me, Cher," he continued, gazing at her face. God, he thought, she looked so frail. Tears formed in the corners of his eyes. "I love her so much. How can I live without her?" Her eyes fluttered, and she gazed into his face. He was surprised. Her dark eyes were alert, bright and purposeful, no longer dulled by drugs and pain. Suddenly her fingers coiled around his so tightly that he gasped. Her mouth moved. He bent closer, straining to catch her words. "Ter," she whispered, her lips almost touching his ear. "You already know what I'm going to say, what I already said to you when I left you so many months ago. I told you that I loved you, and you held my hand. You held me as my breath slowed and watched as my eyes closed. My last vision of this earth was of your faithful, loving face." Tears burned in his eyes and flowed silently down his cheeks. "I remember," he said softly. He felt her stir, and her hand moved across the back of his neck, caressing his cheek. "Terry," she said, "look at me." He shuddered, unwilling to break their embrace. Gently her hand stroked his face, and her fingers raised his chin. He opened his eyes. The hospital room was gone. She was sitting across from him at a small table beneath a starlit sky. She was wearing a beautiful dress, and her eyes were shining in the moonlight. Her favorite earrings, the ones he had presented to her for their 20th anniversary, dangled from her ears. Unseen, the gentle sound of the surf came in on a warm sea salt breeze. "Terry," she continued, "this is how I want you to remember me, vibrant and lovely and alive. I want you to see the two of us, together, enjoying a beautiful night out under the stars." He stared at her in silence. "God, Cher," he thought, "it's true. Since you died, the only image of you I could see was your wasted body, your suffering and pain. I would have done anything to be able to spare you, to be able to save you." He nodded, wonder in his eyes. She smiled, and she leaned across the table and entwined her fingers in his. The scent of her perfume was intoxicating. They kissed, and Terry's head swam. "Sherry, I understand now," he thought. "I had forgotten all the good things that we had, the wonderful life we lived together. I was foolish and selfish and wallowing in my pain." He broke away and held his head up, staring into her eyes. "I have to tell her," he realized. His head was pounding. Sweat beaded on his lips, and he felt as though he were choking. "Sherry, my love, I broke my word." She looked at him, a question in her dark eyes. "I promised you I would not give up, that I would watch over the kids, that I would go on without you." He paused as a terrible pain gathered in his chest. Sweat poured from his brow and his neck burned with fire. "I couldn't do it." Her image was suddenly blurred, indistinct. He tried to draw a hand across his eyes, but his arms were numb, unresponsive. "Sherry," he gasped, but no sound emerged from his paralyzed lips. A great pit seemed to open before him, his knees buckled, and he fell headlong into the yawning void. Terry opened one eye. His head was pounding, and his neck felt as if it had been seared with a welding torch. Wan sunlight fell into the room, catching dust motes. He drew a shallow breath. His throat burned, and his tongue was dry. "I'm alive," he thought. He rolled onto his back. Dried blood caked one eye shut, and his hair was matted to his scalp. On the plus side, his neck appeared to be bruised but not broken. When he sat up, sharp pains shot through his back and shoulder. "How?" he wondered aloud, his voice a guttural rasp. The broken noose hung above him. "Sherry," he whispered, "you did it. You showed me the good memories I had forgotten, the true treasure that I had all but thrown away. You saved me." He sat up, gathering his strength. "The chest," he thought as it caught his eye. "I know I shut it last night, yet it's open now." He rubbed his eyes, but the inexplicable sight remained. "Last night I climbed on top of it and I jumped," he marveled aloud. "It had to be closed." Sheer wonder gave his legs strength. He rose, blood thundering in his ears, and stood swaying like a man on the deck of a heaving ship. The memory chest was half in shadow, the level beams of dawn fully in his eyes. Dazzled, he took a shaky step forward, and then another. Suddenly the scent of Sherry's intoxicating perfume wafted into his nose. He froze, his mind racing. "Sherry!" he sighed. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply as he knelt before the chest, his hands resting on its iron-bound lip. He drew another deep breath. Her scent still lingered in the air. He opened his eyes and gazed down into its shadowed interior, where the faint sparkle of the night before now blazed in the light of the new dawn. "Treasure," he breathed in wonder, "treasure overflowing."